The pit should have been untouched. That was the whole point of the expedition. Push into the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in the 1840s, sink a shaft into the ancient rock, and pull out native copper no one had ever touched. Instead, the engineers hit stone hammers, dozens of them, then ash, then the unmistakable shape of old mine workings. Walls cut and widened by human hands, fire-setting scars where someone had cracked the rock face with heat and then cold water. Over and over, following the same copper veins these men thought they were discovering. Someone had been here first, not decades before, not centuries. The stratigraphy suggested thousands of years. One engineer pulled a single stone hammer from a layer that should have been bedrock, turned it over in his hands, and understood in that moment that he was not a pioneer. He was a latecomer standing at the bottom of someone else's finished work. The question that followed him out of that pit, and that would eventually reach the floor of the US Congress, was the one no one could answer. Who built these mines, and how long ago? To understand what those engineers found at the bottom of that pit, you have to understand what sits beneath the Keweenaw Peninsula, because the geology here is not normal. The Keweenaw is a narrow finger of land that juts into Lake Superior from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and underneath it runs one of the most extraordinary copper deposits on the planet. Not copper ore bound up in sulfide minerals the way most of the world's copper is found, requiring complex smelting and processing to extract. Native copper, pure metallic copper, formed in the vesicles of ancient basalt flows, precipitated there by hydrothermal fluids roughly a billion years ago. Chunks of it the size of a fist, boulders of it. One specimen pulled from the Keweenaw in the industrial era weighed nearly 500 tons. This is copper you can pick up, and it is already copper. No furnace, no flux, no metallurgy required, just pressure and skill. You can hammer it cold, the way a blacksmith works iron, and it will hold an edge, take a shape, become a tool. That property is almost unique on Earth, and it means that any culture that stumbled onto this deposit didn't need to invent a whole technology to use it. They had an immediate advantage, starting on their first day. The question is how early someone made that discovery, and what they chose to do with it. The engineers who climbed down into those pits didn't find untouched copper. They found a workplace, frozen mid-task, as if the workers had simply walked away and never come back. Stone hammers by the thousands, many still grouped near the faces where they'd last been swung. Wooden scoops and bowls used to bail out rainwater that pooled in the deeper shafts, and scorched rock everywhere. Evidence of fire setting, the technique of building fires directly against the stone face to heat it, then dousing it with water so thermal shock would crack open the rock and free the copper within. Primitive in name only. It worked, and it left marks that couldn't be mistaken. Charles Whittlesey, the geologist who conducted the Federal Survey in 1863, spent months cataloging what he found. He recorded pit after pit running for miles along the same copper-bearing veins, some up to 30 feet deep, all connected by the same toolkit, the same method, the same unmistakable human intention. The scale was hard to absorb. Estimates of the total copper removed from these sites run into the hundreds of millions of pounds, a number that stops making sense as a local industry. That much copper implies not a village, not a tribe, but a continent-wide demand, which immediately raises the harder question: where did it all go, and who had the means to move it? Before that can be answered, something more basic has to be settled first. Who worked these mines, and how long ago did they do it? Whittlesey spent months in the field, and the number he arrived at is the one that stopped other scientists cold. Across the Keweenaw Peninsula, following the copper-bearing veins from one end to the other, he counted more than 5,000 discrete excavations. Not 5,000 strikes of a hammer, 5,000 separate pits, each one a deliberate decision to dig here, to work this vein, to extract this deposit. He called the figure almost unbelievable. He wrote it down anyway, because the ground itself left no room for argument. That number does something to the conventional picture of prehistoric North America. Historians had long assumed that the organizational structures required to coordinate large-scale industry, the logistics, the communication, the division of labor, simply didn't exist here before European contact. 5,000 excavations, spread across miles of coastline, worked by the same methods, using the same tools, drawing on the same knowledge of where the copper ran deepest. says otherwise. Something was coordinating this. Some system of knowledge and direction was moving people to the right places, keeping the work consistent, sustaining it across what the evidence suggests were not years or decades, but centuries. What that system looked like, and whether any living memory of it survived, is exactly what a surveyor's report alone could not answer. Knowing how many pits existed was one thing. Knowing when they were dug was another problem entirely. And for a long time, it seemed nearly unsolvable. Stone tools leave no written date. Fire-cracked rock doesn't announce a century. But in the mid-20th century, radiocarbon dating changed the equation, and archaeologists began pulling charcoal from the deepest layers of the ancient workings and sending it to labs. The results came back stranger than most of them expected. The oldest confirmed dates cluster around 5,000 years ago. Not 500. 5,000, which places the earliest Lake Superior copper mining firmly inside what archaeologists now call the Old Copper Complex, a culture operating across the Great Lakes region during a period when most of the world's recognized civilizations were barely taking shape. The Egyptian pyramids at Giza were still centuries away from being built when someone on the Keweenaw Peninsula was already organizing large-scale metal extraction. And this wasn't experimental or occasional. The scale, the consistency, the sheer repetition encoded in those 5,000 pits, it points to something sophisticated, sustained, and knowledgeable running for not hundreds, but potentially thousands of years. A metallurgical tradition that would not be matched again in North America for millennia after it ended. Which raises the question the dating evidence cannot answer on its own. At some point, the hammers stopped falling. The pits went quiet. The culture that organized all of this apparently disappeared from the archaeological record and left almost no explanation. Why did it stop? And where did the people go? But before we get to the silence, we should spend a moment with the sound. The actual sound of this operation while it was running. Stone against copper, wood against stone, fire crackling against a rock face that had never seen air. The miners worked with what the land provided. Stone mauls, some weighing up to 30 pounds, shaped from beach cobbles and grooved near the center so a wooden handle could be lashed tight. They drove these into copper seams directly, a technique called cold hammering, which works because native copper is unusually ductile. It doesn't shatter under impact, it deforms. And skilled hands learned to read exactly how much force freed a mass from the surrounding rock without losing it to fracture. Where the rock itself was the obstacle, they used fire. Build a blaze against the face, heat the stone until it expands, then douse it. The thermal shock opens cracks that no maul could create. Then they moved in with the hammers. Wooden levers, where the geometry allowed, pried loosened sections free, and one of those wooden tools survived, carbon dated to over 3,000 years old, recovered from underwater and sediment, still visibly shaped by human hands. Not an idea of the method, the actual instrument, which tells you something important, not just about the technology, but about the people. This toolkit didn't spring up fully formed. Cold hammering a specific mineral with a specific stone weight at a specific angle is learned knowledge. It accumulates across generations. Someone had to fail first, many times. The sophistication here implies a long developmental history before the first major pit was ever opened. And the pits required more than technique. 5,000 extraction sites don't run themselves. Somebody decided where to dig, who digs, how the copper moves from pit to shore. That level of coordination, without writing, without the bureaucratic structures historians once assumed were prerequisites for organized industry, is its own kind of puzzle. So, somebody coordinated the operation. Fine. But that raises the harder problem, the one that stops archaeologists cold when they run the numbers. Estimates based on the excavated pits, the volume of displaced rock, and the copper content of the ore beds suggest that somewhere between 500 million and 1 billion pounds of native copper were extracted from the Lake Superior Basin over the full span of ancient mining. That is not a rounding error. That is an industrial quantity. Then you look at what has actually been found. Copper artifacts recovered from archaeological sites across the entire North American continent. Tools, ornaments, ceremonial objects, trade goods, everything catalogued from every dig, account for perhaps 1% of that figure. Maybe less. The arithmetic is stark. 99% of the copper that came out of those pits is simply gone, not unexcavated, not waiting under a field somewhere. Gone from the archaeological record entirely, which is a different and much stranger thing. Copper does not vanish. It corrodes slowly, yes, but buried copper survives millennia. What survives is what stayed. The question is what left, and that question has a shape to it. Moving copper in those quantities, continent-scale quantities, requires watercraft, routes, and a destination. Someone had the means and the reason to carry it somewhere the archaeology has not yet found, which opens a possibility historians have argued about for over a century. Did the copper leave the continent entirely? And if so, who took it? Here is one answer to that question. Not speculation, but artifact. A copper breastplate recovered from a burial mound in Tennessee was submitted to chemical analysis, and the isotope signature came back unmistakable. Keweenaw Peninsula, a piece of Michigan, lying in a Tennessee grave 1,000 miles from the shoreline where it was pulled out of the earth. That is not trade in the loose sense of the word. That is a supply chain. And Tennessee is not an outlier. Lake Superior copper shows up in Hopewell burial mounds in Ohio, elaborate ceremonial sites dated to roughly 2,000 years ago. It appears at Gulf Coast sites. It appears in New England. The same isotope fingerprint, the same source, distributed across a continent in patterns too consistent to be coincidence, and too wide to be local exchange. This is the Hopewell interaction sphere, archaeologists' name for a trade network of continental scale, moving not just copper but obsidian, mica, shark teeth, and carved stone across distances that should, by every assumption we carry about prehistoric logistics, have been impossible. Which forces the harder question the Tennessee breastplate opens. If copper moved 1,000 miles overland, through forests, across rivers, passed hand to hand through communities that never saw Lake Superior, what stopped it at the coastline? The same watercraft that worked the Great Lakes could work open water. The routes existed. The demand apparently existed. But here is what the distribution map quietly demands we reckon with. Coordinating extraction at this scale, the mining, the transport, the redistribution, requires something. Organization, memory, authority, or its functional equivalent. Historians long assumed those structures simply weren't there. The copper says otherwise. That memory, the organization, the authority, the coordinated extraction, didn't disappear when the mining stopped. It survived, just not in stone or copper. It survived in speech, passed from elder to elder across generations that had no alphabet and needed none. The Ojibwe people have lived along the shores of Lake Superior longer than written records reach, and within their oral traditions, the ancient mines are not a mystery. They are a memory, a specific one. In 1894, an account was recorded from Ojibwe elders describing the people who had worked the copper before them. What made the account striking wasn't that they remembered the mines. Anyone living near those pits would. What made it striking was who they said did the work. The elders did not claim the ancient miners as their own ancestors. They described them as a separate people, strangers, people who had come from across the water, worked the copper for a time, and eventually left. That detail changes the question entirely, because if the Ojibwe oral tradition is accurate, then we aren't looking for a culture that slowly faded. We're looking for one that arrived extracted on an enormous scale and then departed, leaving behind 10,000 pits and no forwarding address, which opens the harder problem. Who were the strangers in the Ojibwe account, and can oral tradition, passed across dozens of generations, be treated as actual historical evidence? That depends on what we think oral tradition is capable of preserving. And the answer there is more complicated than most people expect. In 1894, a researcher working among Ojibwe communities in the Great Lakes region recorded something that historians have been arguing about ever since. The elders he interviewed didn't speak in vague mythological terms. They described the ancient copper workers with specificity. Their physical appearance, distinct from the Ojibwe themselves, their methods of extraction, and critically, their departure. Not a fading, a leaving. One detail in particular recurs across multiple independent accounts, collected at different times and places. The strangers arrived in large canoes from the direction of the sunrise, east, across water. That directional consistency isn't incidental, it's the kind of specific, verifiable detail that oral traditions tend to either preserve faithfully or drop entirely. The fact that it appears in separate accounts, recorded independently, is exactly what makes researchers take notice. The elders described men who worked the copper with a knowledge and scale the Ojibwe had not inherited, and who eventually loaded what they had extracted and left the way they came. No gradual decline, no absorption into local culture, a withdrawal. That raises a question this account alone cannot answer. Can any of this be corroborated? Not confirmed through oral tradition, but tested against physical or archaeological evidence. And what would corroboration even look like when you're working with a gap of 3,000 years? Those are the questions archaeologists have been pressing. And the ground, it turns out, has been slowly talking back. The ground talking back is exactly what a cluster of researchers in the 1980s and 90s argued it was doing, and what they heard was uncomfortable for mainstream archaeology. Their case runs like this. Somewhere between 500,000 and 1 billion pounds of copper was extracted from the Lake Superior Basin during the late Archaic period. North American archaeological sites from that era account for a fraction of it. The Ojibwe oral account describes outsiders arriving, extracting at scale, and leaving. So where is the rest? Their answer: it crossed the Atlantic. Bronze Age Europe, specifically the Mediterranean, had a copper problem. Demand for bronze was outpacing local supply around 1200 BCE, precisely the window when Great Lakes mining appears to have peaked. The hypothesis is that Phoenician or other seafaring peoples made the crossing, that the Ojibwe account is a memory of exactly that contact, and that the missing copper is sitting in Bronze Age swords and helmets on another continent entirely. Mainstream archaeologists largely reject this, but their counter-argument is more precise than a flat dismissal. It is not that the copper was unused. It is that the redistribution networks inside North America, the trade routes, the burial caches, the secondary working sites, have simply not been fully mapped. The continent is large, the survey is incomplete, and copper that traveled overland for centuries leaves a thinner trail than copper that stayed in one place. The absence of evidence, they argue, is not the evidence of absence it appears to be. That is a legitimate methodological point, but it leaves the central question open in both directions. What would actually resolve this? A dated copper artifact in a Bronze Age Mediterranean context with an isotopic signature matching Lake Superior ore would be close to definitive. That analysis is technically possible. Copper carries a geochemical fingerprint tied to its source deposit. No such confirmed match has been published, which means the debate sits exactly where uncomfortable debates tend to sit. Neither proven nor disproven, waiting on evidence that may or may not exist. Did the copper leave the continent entirely? And if it did, who took it? So here is what the excavations have actually settled. The ancient copper mines of Lake Superior were real, they were extensive, and they were worked at a scale that no one in 1840 expected to find. The hammers, the fire-setting scars, the depth of the pits, the carbon dates, these are not disputed. The operation ran for thousands of years, paused, and then stopped. The copper was extracted in quantities that dwarf what later commercial mining initially recovered from the same deposits. Those are facts. What remains genuinely open is the destination. The copper left. Where it went, whether it fed burial networks across the continent, whether any portion crossed an ocean, whether the redistribution was purely internal or reached farther. That question has no confirmed answer. The isotopic tools exist. The analysis has not been done at the scale that would settle it. But here is the one thing every serious researcher in this field agrees on. The operation was industrial, it was organized, and it was sustained across centuries. That alone should permanently revise how we think about prehistoric North America. This was not a scattering of opportunistic digging. It was coordinated extraction on a continental scale, run by people whose social and logistical sophistication we are only beginning to account for. And that revision has consequences that reach well beyond copper. If the scale was this large, if the organization was this deep, what does accepting that fully mean for the broader story of human civilization in the Americas? That question opens something the copper debate alone cannot close. That question, what accepting this fully means, doesn't resolve cleanly. It unsettles something deeper than a single timeline, because the Lake Superior copper mines are not a theory. They are not a disputed text or a contested translation. They are holes in the ground, Some of them are still there, open on the Keweenaw Peninsula today. Pits older than writing, older than the wheel in Europe, cut by hands we cannot name into rock that remembers every blow. They were always there. The engineers found them in the 1840s. Whittlesey catalogued them in 1863. The Ojibwe never forgot them at all. And yet for well over a century, the dominant story of the Americas had no room for what they implied. That is the real mystery, not who took the copper, though that question still has no settled answer. Not where it went, though the distribution problem remains genuinely open. The deeper mystery is this: the evidence was never hidden. It was sitting in the earth, in federal survey reports, in the memories of people who had lived beside it for generations. What took so long was not discovery, it was willingness. The readiness to look at what was plainly there and revise the story accordingly. And if one chapter this large was hiding in plain sight, an industrial operation spanning centuries, organized across a continent, remembered in oral tradition with precision that archaeology keeps confirming, then the honest question is how many others are? What else is sitting in the record, or in the ground, or in the knowledge of people whose accounts we have not yet taken seriously enough? The copper mines did not close that question, they opened it.